Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's December 24th, and welcome to the holiday edition of RealTalk MS. The holiday season always seems to carry with it the message of hope, finding the best side of who we are. So one of the gifts that I'm going to unwrap with you today is a replay of a conversation that I had earlier this year with two people who epitomize hope, humanity, and love. And to me, well, that's what the holiday is all about. And that's what Dan and Jennifer Digmann are all about. Jennifer was diagnosed with progressive MS in 1997, and Dan was diagnosed with relapsing remitting MS in the year 2000. Dan and Jennifer met at a National MS Society event in 2002, and they were married in 2005. Together, Dan and Jennifer write an MS blog, they host a podcast, they've written a book, and they've been inducted into the National MS Society's Hall of Fame for advocacy. Early this year, I had an opportunity to talk with Dan and Jennifer as we were celebrating the first ever Progressive MS Day. And in a few moments, we'll revisit my conversation with Dan and Jennifer Digmann and get their thoughts about what life is like when both partners in a marriage have been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. But first, before we get to Dan and Jennifer, there are a few other things that you should know about. Researchers at Purdue University announced that they may have identified a biomarker for multiple sclerosis. And just as a quick review, a biomarker is a characteristic that can be objectively measured and evaluated as an indicator of normal or abnormal biological processes. For instance, if you go to your doctor because you're running a fever, your doctor might do a blood test. And if the results of the blood test indicate that your white cell count is high, well, your doctor will tell you that you have an infection. That high white cell count is a biomarker for infection. So one of the things that the MS research community is focused on is identifying a reliable biomarker for multiple sclerosis. And last week, a research team at Purdue University announced that acrolein may be a biomarker for MS. Now, acrolein is a byproduct of fat metabolism, and the researchers observed that an accumulation of acrolein is present in animal models of neurological diseases like Parkinson's disease and MS, and even spinal cord and brain injuries. The theory is that acrolein damages cells by disrupting the fats that protect our nerve tissue. And the research team also found that acrolein levels can be measured in animals and humans by both blood tests and urine tests. The researchers have concluded that a high level of acrolein could be a biomarker of MS disease activity. Well, a lot more research will be done to further determine whether acrolein is a biomarker for MS. If it is, it won't only help identify MS disease activity through something as simple as a blood test or a urine test, but it can also drive the development or identification of new disease-modifying therapies, because there are two drugs already on the market today that can lower acrolein levels. One drug is used to treat high blood pressure and the other is used to treat major depression. But repurposing these drugs to be effective in reducing acrolein levels in people living with MS is only going to make sense once larger clinical trials are completed to determine that acrolein levels in fact correlate with MS disease activity. So there are more than a few steps to take here, but every discovery brings us closer to a real win. And I know that sometimes it's easy to get frustrated at the announcement of yet another research project or clinical trial that might not cross the finish line the way that we'd hope for. But scientists understand that even the discoveries that don't lead directly to a win can still be important. Thomas Edison failed 10,000 times trying to invent the electric light bulb. And when someone asked him how he could tolerate all that failure, he said that he never considered those 10,000 attempts to be failures. He just thought that he had identified 10,000 different ways not to invent an electric light bulb. So every step in the lab brings science closer to solving the puzzle of MS. And if acrolein turns out to be a viable biomarker for MS, well, that would be a pretty big step. I'll include a link to that announcement in today's show notes. An international group of researchers analyzed the results of a phase 3 clinical trial for Empira and determined that treatment with Empira for 24 weeks leads to sustained and clinically meaningful improvements in walking ability as reported by people living with MS who are experiencing gait difficulties. So this phase 3 clinical trial was carried out in 10 European countries, the United States, and Russia. It included 636 people living with different subtypes of MS, with ages ranging between 18 and 70. All of the study participants were experiencing walking difficulties, and they were divided into 2 different groups. One group received 10 milligram Empira tablets twice a day, and the other group was given a placebo. And the primary goal of the trial was to see what percentage of the participants exceeded an 8-point improvement on the multiple sclerosis walking scale, which is a patient self-assessment survey that measures walking limitations due to MS. And the reason that the research team was looking at survey results exceeding an 8-point improvement is because this 8-point improvement is considered the threshold for defining clinically meaningful improvement. The study results indicate that a higher proportion of the group given Empira actually achieved that clinically meaningful improvement in their walking ability when compared to the group given a placebo, leading the research team to conclude that patients being treated with Empira had a 61% higher chance of improving their walking ability. The study also showed that a greater number of patients being treated with Empira reported the ability to move faster, and they also reported having fewer physical limitations. And while these reported improvements are encouraging, please keep in mind that these positive effects are lost once you stop treatment with Empira, which is one more reminder that when you hear or read good news about treating MS symptoms, it's important to have a discussion with your neurologist so you'll know how that particular treatment is likely going to affect you. And you'll find a link to these study results in today's show notes. Last month, we told you that a company called Brainstorm Cell Therapeutics had submitted an investigational new drug application to the FDA to begin a phase 2 clinical trial designed to evaluate the safety and activity of its cell therapy called Neurone in people living with progressive MS. Well, last week, the FDA accepted that application, so recruitment for that clinical trial will soon get underway. Now, Neurone is a stem cell therapy that takes a patient's own mesenchymal stem cells, modifies them, and returns them to the patient to promote nerve cell supporting mechanisms. These modified stem cells are engineered to produce signaling molecules that regulate the activity of surrounding cells, as well as secrete neurotropic factors that support the growth and survival of nerve cells. The company's expectations are that these modified mesenchymal stem cells could regulate neurodegeneration while protecting neurons from damage. Over the past year, we've heard more encouraging news about progressive MS research than perhaps ever before. And in the midst of lots of conversation about stem cell treatments, it's especially gratifying to see these new emerging treatments subjected to a high level of scientific examination so that we can fully understand their safety implications as well as their benefits. Cannabis-based treatments for MS continue to gain a lot of attention. Studies have shown that cannabidiol can help manage pain and spasticity for people living with MS. And OWS Pharmaceutical Research, an Israeli-based company, has received approval from an institutional review board in Israel to begin clinical trials of its cannabinoid-enriched sublingual tablet. The clinical trial will be conducted in 2019 at the Sourasky Academic Medical Center in Tel Aviv. The tablet, which simply dissolves under your tongue, offers an alternative and actually an improvement to smoking or inhalation, because with a tablet, the dosage can be more consistent and accurate. We'll keep you updated on the study results as they're made available. In a moment, we'll revisit a conversation that I had earlier this year with Dan and Jennifer Digmann. Full disclosure, they're two of my favorite people, and our interview remains one of my favorite conversations out of the dozens that I've had this year. So if you haven't yet had the pleasure, get ready to meet Dan and Jennifer Digmann, and we'll get their thoughts about what life is like when both partners in a marriage have been diagnosed with MS. I'm thrilled to have Dan and Jennifer Digmann as my guests today on the podcast. Jennifer was diagnosed with progressive MS in 1997, and Dan was diagnosed with relapsing remitting MS in the year 2000. Jennifer and Dan met at a National MS Society event back in 2002, and they were married in 2005. And together, and by the way, I think together is really the operational word when it comes to these two. Together, they write an award-winning MS blog. They host the A Couple Takes on MS podcast on the MS&Me radio network. They've co-authored a book entitled Despite MS to Spite MS. And in 2015, they were inducted into the National MS Society Volunteer Hall of Fame for Advocacy. Full disclosure, after following their blog and their podcast, I met Dan and Jennifer a few weeks ago in Washington, D.C. at the National MS Society's Public Policy Conference and Day on Capitol Hill, and I immediately invited them to join me on the podcast. So welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Now, Wednesday, March 28th is the first ever Progressive MS Day, and it's being celebrated by several MS advocacy groups and state governments. So tell me, what is Progressive MS Day all about, and what makes it important to you?
For me, it's confirmation that those of us living with progressive multiple sclerosis have not been forgotten. And it's a day to recognize and just acknowledge the fact that progressive multiple sclerosis, they have treatment option available now, and that it's still a viable population that is important and matters in the community at large. Finally, it's about time because, I was diagnosed with MS actually over 20 years ago, and I watched a number of medications come on the market that were indicated for people with relapsing remitting MS. And I was, feeling a little like, what about me? What about me? And finally now there's a day to celebrate those of us living with a more progressive form of the disease. And there are treatment options available for progressive forms of MS.
Jennifer, I completely understand that what about me perspective. My wife was diagnosed with progressive MS the same year you were. And so we've been on the sideline watching and waiting as well. And absolutely, it's been a really good year for getting good news if you're living with progressive MS. We have the first approved treatment for it. There is some incredible research going on as we speak. And there's, I think, more of a focus on trying to figure out progressive MS than we've ever seen before.
Yes, I agree. And that's an exciting thing. It's an excellent time, if you can say that, living with multiple sclerosis. Dan chuckles.
It is. Well, and I think that's the reality. I've been living with the relapsing remitting MS, but then when you have your wife living with progressive MS, I think it's really easy to obviously focus on the newly diagnosed and everything, but then it's like I always feel like what about the seasoned veterans and those who have been living with it the longest, that really there still needs to be support and recognition for everyone living with the disease. So I think this is, like Jennifer said, it's about time. This is great.
Absolutely. Now, I'll ask the obvious question, I think, since the name of your podcast is A Couple Takes on MS. I'm curious, do you think that MS is more challenging or less challenging to deal with when both partners have been diagnosed with it?
I think, and I don't want to make others out there jealous who don't have a spouse with multiple sclerosis, I think it's a little easier because if I tell Dan that I'm really tired and my fatigue level is high today, or that my numbness in my right hand is making me crazy, he can shake his head and say, I know what you're talking about, and vice versa. And so that innate understanding of the disease is really, I don't want to say it's a blessing, but it is, to say he understands.
And I think on every given day, obviously, there is that understanding, but it's just like then what happens on those days we're both down. Those are the days when it becomes challenging. And I know it's just like, I can help Jennifer with like transfers and things, but if I get sick, that makes the days a lot more challenging. Just because I can't help. I know that we were in the hotel just last year, and I got sick, and I mean, we were basically could not make the trip that we had planned to do because I couldn't help her make transfers because I was so weak. And so, I mean, on those moments, it's just like what we wouldn't give to have an able-bodied spouse in those elements. But I think that's
a good point.
But for the most part, I think Jennifer gets it. And if I'm tired, I don't even need to explain. It's just like you just say, I'm tired. Whereas I think, we lead a self-help group, and just when we hear stories where others are saying that when they comment that they're tired, if they have an able-bodied spouse who doesn't have MS, maybe they don't fully understand what that means. And so, I think in that sense, we're very fortunate.
Well, I know that you're both pretty serious music fans. I think I read that somewhere. And music can be motivating. It can be inspiring. Sometimes music can reflect our mood or our state of mind, and sometimes it can change our mood or change that state of mind. So I'm curious, have you found a way to make music a part of your battle with MS?
I think very much so. Both Dan and I have listened to music and picked up certain song lyrics and turned them into mantras in just an easy way to say, to help us in the battle with MS. And of course, what's great is it's available all the time. So it's a comfort or just something you can always use it, and then it's fun. And it's a good sense of community if you get to go to a concert. So I think music is really important. Wouldn't you agree, Dan?
Well, yeah, of course I do. I do. It's like, from day one after I was diagnosed with MS, I was like, even before MS, I mean, I was a kid of the 80s. So, of course, I fell in love with Bruce Springsteen, born in the USA. And then you just become a fanatic, a freak about Springsteen. And I remember when I was first diagnosed, I made a compilation CD for a religious sister because I had to convince her how Springsteen provided a religious experience. And there were like 8 songs that totally helped me overcome and deal with life with MS and get a vision for a brighter future. And so, I mean, Springsteen's always been my go-to. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Since you just mentioned finding ways to deal with a life with MS, I know the title of your book is Despite MS to Spite MS. How do you live each day despite MS, and what do you do to spite MS?
We went to an exercise class, and it was very much like, take that, MS. Look at me. I'm using my arms, and I'm getting a workout. And so I think that's one of the things that we both do is I try and say, I don't want to be cocky, but a little bit like, is that the best you got, MS? Look at me. I'm trying to spite you, and I'm living the best life as I possibly can. I'm not letting the disease hold me back. And yes, that can be challenging because the disease is a pretty strong monster, but I don't want to give it any more than it deserves to take from me.
And I think that's just, because Jennifer and I, when we met, we both had MS. And I mean, there's just a lot of questions you have as you're looking at, I really want to spend my life with this woman, but we both have MS. How is this going to work? And I think that really just, it's like we got married despite the fact that we had MS. And so then I think everything we've done since then, every day is just so you do it to spite it. It's just like just even getting up in the morning, or like Jennifer said, going to the exercise classes, or just doing things that we're not supposed to be able to do because of the disease. I think that's just to spite it every day.
I'm wondering if there is a particular moment, event, or experience that you might have had in the past together that you'd consider one of the most challenging aspects of your MS journey together, and maybe to counter that, to balance it out a little bit, if there's a moment or experience that's been one of the most rewarding aspects of your MS journey.
Well, John, I instantly think when Dan and I first were married, maybe 2 to 3 months, you're laughing. When we were first married, we'd been married maybe 2 or 3 months, and as he said, I need his help to transfer to use the restroom. And he was going to transfer me, and the transfer didn't go well, and I ended up in a pile on the floor. And of course, my emotions are, I'm newly married, and I'm crying, and I look up at my husband, and I say, it's not too late if we wanted to get an annulment, or if you wanted to get an annulment, I imagine we probably could. And, baby, I don't want you to have to deal with me and not being able to do things on my own. So I think that was one of the most challenging moments, and we reference back to that still to this day, 12 years into our marriage, because I think that was one of those. And Dan just looked at me. He put his hands on my face just so he could totally have my attention. He said, Jennifer, I took the vows. I'm in this for the long haul, and I hope you feel the same way. And there's never been talk of a divorce or annulment since. We're in this together for the long haul.
Do we have maybe a particularly rewarding moment or experience that comes to mind?
That's you, Dan. I got the easy one.
I think, as far as specific moments, I think that, boy, there's so many, but I think just anything we do, I think, the first time that we flew together with the wheelchair, making, there's so much that goes into traveling with the wheelchair, with the disability, and making transfers and stuff. And how would we be able to do that without the safety net of her parents close by, if anything were to go terribly wrong? And so I think it was when we made that first flight, I think, and it was actually out to Washington D.C. by ourselves for several years ago for our first ever public policy conference. There was a lot of fear of what happens, if you're in, we're in familiar territories here in Mount Pleasant. It's just so if we fall or something goes bad, you know where to call, you know where to get the help. But what happens when you're in the middle of the airport, or you're in the middle of Washington, D.C. or hotels? How is this going to happen? It's just when you do it that one time, you see what it takes to make that happen. That opened up our whole world, that we weren't just relegated to visiting places that we could only drive to. It's just now we can, tackle I want to say the world, but there's just so many things we can do to be able to go out and do more. So I think that just gave us the reassurance and
the confidence.
Yeah, to say that this can happen and we can do this. And so I think that so then every trip thereafter, has been just a major accomplishment for us, and that those are always. It's I think that's part of what the disease is. You find ways to celebrate every victory, everything that goes well, because how bad things potentially could go.
Yes, and we appreciate and we recognize every small accomplishment, and any moment that we get together, we really, really value each other, and we know that we're lucky that we have each other, and we understand, and we're silly in the fact that we just like to be together. Dan and I have always joked, that when we're together, we're always together. I mean, we just really, so I think those moments that we can best multiple sclerosis, those are huge accomplishments for us.
And then in turn, because we have such a strong support system, we want to be out there to help other people who maybe don't have that kind of support. Just, if we can be there just to help the other person to realize that, you can do this. And just, we've got combined over 40 years of experience with the disease. I mean, just to give people help and tips, and that's why we do the blog. And
likewise, we get that back from the community, because our MS community is pretty awesome and tight together. We're lucky to be part, and unwillingly part of an MS community. None of us wanted to be diagnosed, but since you're in a strong community of really supportive people that share their stories with you and want to hear your stories.
Well, speaking about that community, today we're talking about Progressive MS Day, and for several people, today's going to be the day when they're diagnosed with progressive MS. What advice or words of wisdom would you share with those people today?
Just give yourself a little bit of time to accept it, to understand, surround yourself with really, your team, get a strong team, whether it's your family and friends or your neurologist, your physical therapist. Get a really good team, give yourself time, and just don't give up on yourself. That just because it's a diagnosis of a more progressive form of multiple sclerosis, it doesn't mean that you can't still sustain a really quality life. I mean, if you're afraid of potentially someday ending up in a wheelchair, get over that fear. I know I don't want to say a wheelchair is a good place to be, but I know that's that's to me the scariest thing about multiple sclerosis, and that's where I was when I met Dan. And so there are bigger fears than things like that. You need to take care of your health, watch your diet, and make good choices like that, and stay active and get involved in the community. I think that's big for me, is to be involved, whether it's the National MS Society or the MS Foundation. Just get involved, because there's Facebook communities, Twitter, there's so many social media platforms. This podcast right now, John, there are so many ways to learn about multiple sclerosis. I think knowledge is important, and a support system.
And I think just having that faith in yourself. I know that when the day I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, it's the very next day I woke up, and I'm just like, I'm still the same person I was yesterday. Just having this diagnosis doesn't make me a different person. I don't have to instantly change my life. And so I think, you're when you're diagnosed and you're to the point of a progressive form of the disease, I mean, from one day to the next, I mean, there's nothing different about what you are. I mean, there's the same challenges and everything. Obviously, stuff didn't get better, but things didn't get worse overnight just because you have that formal diagnosis. And so it's just like, how do you push forward? And that's where, like Jennifer talked about, building your team and getting people there. I mean, so that the one thing you don't want to do is close yourself off from the rest of the world, because that's very challenging. But I mean, keep yourself connected to other people.
Well, I asked if you had any words of wisdom, and I think you just shared some really important ones. Dan and Jennifer Digmann, we can find your blog at www.danandjenniferdigmann.com. We can find your podcast, A Couple Takes on MS, on the MS&Me radio network. And we can also find your book, Despite MS to Spite MS, at your website. Thank you so much for joining me today for the first annual Progressive MS Day.
Thank you very much, John. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, John. And don't forget, #Progressive MS Day.
Well, that's going to wrap up this Christmas edition of Real Talk MS. I hope that wherever you are, you're enjoying a wonderful holiday season. I'll be back next week to tie a bow on 2018 and look ahead to the new year. My name is John Strum. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.